1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. One, two, three. Alright, cool, that's working. Da 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 da. That looks like it's working. That's good. Oh. All right. So last time, still on the Federalist Papers, we got through number 36, which was all the taxation ones, and now I think we're gonna get into like, I think the next like 3 or 4-ish are Madison, kind of defending. I don't know what it is, but I know it's Madison. I guess we'll find out. Leave us on a cliffhanger, finding out what his defenses are. We had a lot of Hamilton, but it's gonna move on to Madison for a bit. Concerning the difficulties of convention in devising a proper form of government. From the Daily Advisor, James Madison, to the people of New York. In reviewing the defects of the existing confederation and showing they cannot be supplied by a government of less energy than that of before the public, several of the most important principles of the latter fell of course under consideration. But as the ultimate object of these papers is to determine clearly and fully the merits of the Constitution and expediency of adopting it, our plan cannot be complete without taking a more critical and thorough survey of the work of the convention, without examining it on all sides, comparing it, and in all parts calculating the probable effects. All right, so he's probably, I'm not sure exactly what this one about. It sounds like why the Articles of Confederation should be used, or why not the Articles of Confederation? Why the Constitutional Convention is like. Okay, it's yelling at me for copyrighted content. This is not copyrighted. This is the Articles of Confederation, or not the Articles of Confederation. How is this copyrighted? Okay. All right, what's going on? Alright, well, maybe that fixed it. It's really annoying for some reason. I really shouldn't be yelling at me for copyright friction when it's literally not. Alright. That this remaining task may be executed under the impressions conducive to a just and fair result. Some reflections must in this place be indulged, which candor previously suggests. Oh, I don't even think this is showing up now that I tried to fix it. Since it was yelling at me. Alright. It is a misfortune inseparable from human affairs that the public measure are rarely investigated with the spirit of modernation, which is essential to a just estimate of their real tendency to advance or obstruct the public good. And that is this spirit is more apt to be diminished than promoted by those occasions which require an unusual exercise of it. To those who have been led by experience to attend this consideration, it could not appear surprising that the act of the convention which recommends so much important changes and innovations, which may be viewed in so many lights and relations, and to which touches the springs of so many passions and interests, should find or excite dispositions unfriendly, both on one side and on the other, to a fair discussion and accurate judgment of its merits. In some, it has been too evident from their own publications that they have scanned and proposed the Constitution, not only with predisposition to censure, but also with predetermination to condemn, as the language held by others betrays an opposite predetermination or bias, which must render their opinions also of little moment in the question, in placing, however, these different characters on a level with respect to the weight of their own opinions. I wish not to insinuate that there must not be a material difference in the purity of intentions, but it is just remark in favor of the latter description, and that as our situation is universally admitted to be a particularly critical, and to require indispensably that something should be done for our relief, that our predetermined patron of what has actually been done may have taken his bias from the weight of these considerations, as well as from considerations of a sinister nature. The predetermined adversary, on the other hand, can have been governed by no venial motive whatsoever. The intentions of the first may be upright, as the contrary to be culpable. The views of the last cannot be upright and must be culpable. But the truth is that these papers are not addressed to the persons failing under either of these characters. They solicit the attention of only who's at a sincere zeal for the happiness of the country, a temper favorable, and a just estimate of the means of promoting it. Persons of this character will proceed with an examination of the plan submitted by the convention, not only without a disposition to find or to magnify faults, but will see the propriety of reflecting that the faultless plan was not to be expected, nor will they barely make allowances for the errors which may be chargeable on the fallibility to which the convention as a body of men were liable, but will keep in mind that themselves also are but men, and ought to not assume the infallibility in rejudging the fallible opinions of others. Wall. Okay, Wall. Yes, indeed, Wall. With equal readiness will be perceived that besides these inducements to candor, many allowances ought to be made on the difficulties inherent of the very nature of undertaking the referred convention. Man, Hamilton is, Madison is not as like smooth a writer as Hamilton. He feels more herky-jerky. The novelty of undertaking immediate strikes us immediately strikes us, it has been shown in the course of these papers that the existing confederation is founded on principles that which are fallacious, that we must constant, constantly change this first foundation, and with it the superstructure resting upon it. It has been shown that the other confederacies which have been consulted as precedents had the same erroneous principles, and can therefore furnish no other light than that of beacons, which give us warning of the course to be shunned, without pointing out which ought to be pursued. All right, Willie. The most conventions could do in such a situation was to avoid the errors suggested by the past experience of other countries, as well as our own, and to provide a convenient mode of rectifying their own errors as the experiments unfold them. Among the difficulties encountered by the convention, a very important one must have lain in combining the requisite stability and energy of the government. With the inviolable attention due to the liberty and to the republican form, without substantially accomplishing this part of their undertaking, that would have a very imperfectly fulfilled the object of their appointment, or the expectation of the public. Yet, that it could be not easily accomplished, will be denied by no one who is unwilling to betray his ignorance of the subject. Energy in government is essential to the security against external and internal danger, and to prompt and salutary execution of the laws to which enter the definition of good government. Stability in government is essential to national character and to the advantages annexed to it, as well as that repose and confidence in the minds of the people, which are among the chief blessings of civil society. An irregular and mutable legislation is not more an evil in itself than the odious to the people. What are the Federalist Papers? They were papers written by Madison and Hamilton mostly, but it was basically as the Articles of Confederation were ending, and they were like the Constitutional Congress was getting together, and they were writing the Constitution. They wrote the Federalist Papers, like explaining the Constitution, like defenses of it, trying to convince people to. The main point was to get people to convince them to ratify the Constitution. They have now written the Constitution. The Articles of Confederation have been a failure, so now they're trying to go around and convince all the states to ratify the Constitution. And mostly they were publishing these in papers. Like they'll all start like to the people of New York, because they would always like. They were living in New York, Madison and Hamilton, and so they would post to New York, get the big, and then other newspapers would pick them up throughout the country. And it may be pronounced with assurance that the people of this country, enlightened as they are with regard to the nature and interested as the great body of them are in the effects of good government, will never be satisfied till some remedy be applied to the vicissitudes and uncertainties which characterize the state administrations. The Federalist Papers are really good because you read something in the Constitution, you'll be like, okay, what does that mean? And basically this is like, you can go to the Federalist Papers and like, oh, they're explaining their thought process and why they did this in the Constitution. On comparing, however, these valuable ingredients with the vital principle of liberty, we must perceive at once the difficulty of mingling them together in their due proportions. The genius of republican liberty seems to demand on one side not only that all power should be derived from the people, but those entrusted with it should be kept in independence on the people by a short duration of their appointments, and that even during the short period the trust should be placed not in a few, but a number of hands. Stability, on the contrary, requires that the hands in which the power is lodged should continue for a length of time the same. Frequent changes of men will result from a frequent returns of elections, and frequent change in measures from frequent changes of men. whilst energy in government requires not only a certain duration of power, but the execution of it by a single hand. All right, so he's going like, okay. How far the convention may succeed in this part of their work will better appear to be a more accurate view of it. From the cursory view here taken, it must clearly appear to have been an arduous part. Not less arduous must have been the task of marking the proper line of partition between the authority of the general and that of the state governments. Every man will be sensible of this difficulty, in the proportion as he has been accustomed to contemplate and discriminate objects extensive and complicated in their nature. The facilities of the mind itself have never yet been distinguished and defined with satisfactory precision. By all the efforts of the most acute and metaphysical philosophers, sense, perception, judgment, desire, volition, memory, imagination are found to be separated by such delicate shades and minute gradations that their boundaries have eluded the most subtle investigations, and remained a pregnant source of ingenious disquisition and controversy. The boundaries between the great kingdom of nature and the still more between the various provinces and lesser portions into which they have subdivided form another illustration of the same important truth. The most sagacious, I have to look up this word, having shown in keen or discernment or good judgment. Sagacious. I did not know this word. And laborious naturalists have never succeeded in tracing with certainty the line which separates the distinct of vegetable life from the neighboring region of unorganized matter, or which marks their termination of the former and the commencement of the animal empire. A still greater obscurity lies in the distinction character which objects of each of these great departments of nature have been arranged and assorted. When we pass from the works of nature, in which all the delineations are perfectly accurate, and peer from the otherwise only from imperfection of the eye which surveys them, to the institutions of man, in which obscurity arises, as well as from the objects as itself, as from the organ by which it is contemplated, we must perceive the necessity of moderating still further our expectation and hopes from the efforts of the human I just learned this word and I still can't pronounce it. He used this word just a second ago. Sagacity. Experience has instructed us that no skill in the science of government has yet been able to discriminate and define with sufficient certainty its three great provinces, the legislature, executive, and judiciary, or even the privileges of power of different legislative branches. Questions daily occur in the course of the practice, which prove the obscurity which reigns in these subjects, and which puzzle the greatest adepts in political science. The experiments of ages, which the continued and combined labors of the most enlightened legislators and jurists has been equally unsuccessful in delineating the several objects and limits of the different codes of laws and different tribunals of justice. The precise extent of the common law and the statute law and the maritime law, the church law and the law of corporations and other local laws and customs remain still to be clearly and finally established in Great Britain, where accuracy in such subjects have been more industriously pursued than in any other part of the world. The jurisdiction of her several courts, general, local, of law, equity, of admiralty, etc. It is not less a source of frequent and intricate discussions, sufficiently denoting the intermediate limits by which they are respectively circumcised. All new laws, though penned with the greatest technical skill and passed on the fullest and most mature deliberation, yeah, Liz, we'll just remember these are like the smartest people in the room at the time. They were students of the Enlightenment. They were not, an everyday person, are considered the more or less obscure and equivocal until their meaning be liquidated and ascertained by the series of particular discussions and adjudications. Besides the obscurity arising from the complexity of objects and the imperfection of human faculties, the medium through which the conceptions of men are conveyed to each other adds a fresh embarrassment. The use of words is to express ideas. Therefore, requires not only that the ideas should be distinctly formed, but they should be expressed by words distinctly and exclusively appropriated to them. But no language is so copious as to supply words and phrases for every complex idea, or so correct as not to include many equivocally denoted differences in ideals. Hence, it may happen that however accurately objects may be discriminated in themselves, however accurately the discrimination may be considered, the definition of them is rendered inaccurate by the inaccuracy in terms in which it is delivered. And this is unavoidable. Inaccuracy must be greater or less according to the complexity and novelty of the objects defined. When the Almighty himself condenses to address mankind in their own language, his meaning, luminous as it must be, rendered dim and doubtful by the cloudy medium for which it is communicated. Here, then, are the three sources of vague and incorrect definition: indistinguishness of the object, imperfection of the organ of conception, inaccuracies of the vehicle of ideas. Any one of them must produce a certain degree of obscurity. The convention in delineating the boundary between the federal and state jurisdictions must have experienced the full effect of all. The difficulties already mentioned may be added. The interfering pretensions of the larger and smaller states. We cannot err in supposing that the former would contend for the participation in government fully proportioned to their superior wealth and importance, and that the latter would not be less tenacious of the equally at present enjoyed by them. We may well suppose that neither side would entirely yield to the other. Consequently, that struggle could be terminated only by compromise. It is extremely probable also that after the ratio of representation has been adjusted, this very compromise must have produced a fresh struggle between the same parties. So this is the House of Representatives Senate compromise between big states and little states. To give such a turn to the organization of the government and to the distribution of powers as would increase the importance of the branches, in forming which they had respectively obtained the greatest share of influence. There are features in the Constitution which warrant each of these suppositions, and as far as either of them is well founded, it shows that the convention must have been compelled to sacrifice theoretical property to force the extraneous considerations. Nor could it have been the large and small states only which would marshal themselves in opposition to each other on various points. Other combinations resulting from difference of local positions and policies must have created additional difficulty. So right now it just seems like he's kind of complaining about how hard the Constitutional Congress was. It was like, oh man, all these guys were fighting about this or that. As every state may be divided into different districts, and its citizens into different classes, which give birth to contending interest and local jealousies to the different parts of the United States, are distinguished from each other by a variety of circumstances, which produce a like effect on a large scale. And although this variety of interest, for reasons sufficiently explained in a former paper, may have had a salutary influence on the administration of the government when formed, yet every one must be sensible of the contrary influence, which must have been experienced in the task of forming it. Would it be wonderful if, under the pressure of all these difficulties, the convention should have been forced into some deviations from the artificial structure of regular symmetry, which an abstract view of the subject might lead an ingenious theorist to bestow on the Constitution planned in his closet or in his imagination? The real wonder is that so many difficulties should have been surmounted, and surmounted with a unanimity almost as unprecedented as it must have been unexpected. It is impossible for any man of candor to reflect on the circumstances without partaking of the astonishment. It is impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive in the finger of the Almighty hand which has been so frequently and signally extended to our relief in the critical stages of the revolution. He's like, so he lays out all these problems with the Constitutional Convention, all these hurdles, and he's like, we did it. And he kind of takes it a little too far. He's like, God must have brought his hand down and help us make this. He's like, that's how awesome like these problems were. We had on occasion in a former paper to take notice of the repeated trials to which we have unsuccessfully made the United Netherlands in forming a baneful and notorious vices of the Constitution. The history of almost all the great councils and consultations held among the mankind, reconciling their discordant opinions, assuaging their mutual jealousies, and adjusting their respective interest, in a history of factions, contentions, and disappointments, and may be classed among the most dark and degraded pictures which display the infirmities and depravities of the human character. If in a few scattered instances a brighter aspect is presented, they serve only the exceptions to admonish us of the general truth, and by their luster to darken the gloom, adverse prospects to which they are contrasted. In revolving the causes from which the expositions result and applying them to the particular instances before us, we necessarily lead to two important conclusions. The first, the convention must have enjoyed in a very singular degree an exemption from the prestigial influence of party animosities, the disease most incident to deliberate bodies, and most apt the contamination of their proceedings. The second conclusion is that all deputations composing of the convention were satisfactorily accommodated by the final act, or were induced to accolades to the deep conviction of the necessity of sacrificing private opinions and partial interests to the public good, and by despair of seeing the necessity diminished of delays by new experiences. Publius. All right, that's number 37 down. Ooh. Feeling that was really just like a setup one. I don't know how many he has on the same subject. At least another one, because I can already see that it's the same subject continued. I'm guessing 39. Madison likes to go in threes. Or fours. Oh, maybe just three. I'd be surprised, but all right. All right, number 38. Same subject continued, and the incoherence of the objections to the new plan exposed. January 15th, 1788, James Madison. He always starts off with all caps, too, because he's really a little bit of a drama queen. It is not only a little remarkable that in every case reported by ancient history in which the government has been established with the deliberation and consent, the task of framing it has not been committed to the assembly of men, but has been performed by some individual citizen of predominant wisdom and approved integrity. Minos, we learned, was the primitive founder of the government of Crete, and Zeleucus, we'll go with that. Zeleucus was that of the Lucretians. Decius, first and after Draco of Solon, instituted the government of Athens. Lycurgus was the lawgiver of Sparta. The foundation of the original government of Rome was laid by Romulus, and the work completed by the two of his elected successors, Numa and Tullius Hostilius. I don't know Latin, but I think that's close enough. On the uh, abolition of royalty and the consular administration was substituted by Brutus, who stepped forward with a project for such a reform, which he alleged had been prepared by Tullius Hostilius, and to which address obtained the assent and ratification of the Senate and people. This remark is applicable to confederate governments also. And Greek. Okay. And all right. Google's going to have to help me out on this one. Long Greek name. Amphictyonic? Amphictyonic. Okay. We are told was the author of that to which bore his name. The Acadian League received its first birth from Acadius and the second from Artuus. Madison loves to show off whenever he gets an opportunity. Whenever Madison gets the chance to like show off, like, hey, I know a lot about classic history, he'll rattle off like a bunch of like facts about ancient history just because he knows he can. What degree of agency these reputed lawgivers might have in their respective establishments, or how far they might be clothed with the legitimate authority of the people, cannot in every instance be ascertained. In some, however, the proceeding was strictly regular. Draco appeared to have been entrusted by the people of Athens with the indefinite powers to reform the government and laws, and Solon, according to Plutarch, was in a matter compelled by the universal suffrage of his fellow citizens, and to take upon him the sole and absolute power of new modeling the constitution. The proceedings under Crugus were less regular, but as far as the advocates for a regular reform could prevail, they all turned their eyes toward a single effort that celebrated the patriot and sage, instead of seeking to bring about revolution by the intervention of deliberate body of citizens. Right. Whence could it have been proceeded that the people, jealous as the Greeks were of the liberty, should have the far abandon of the rules of caution as to place their destiny in the hands of a single citizen? Whence could have it proceeded that the Athenians, a people who would not suffer an army to be commanded by fewer than 10 generals, and who required no other proof of danger to their liberties than that the illustrious merit of fellow citizens, should consider one illustrious citizen as more eligible depository for the fortunes of themselves and their prosperity than to select from a body of citizens from whose common deliberations more wisdom as well as more safety might have been expected. These questions cannot be fully answered without supposing that the fears of discourse and disunion among a number of counselors exceeded the apprehension of treachery or incapacity of a single individual. History informs us likewise of the difficulties with which these celebrated reformers had contended, as well as the expediences which they had obliged to employ in order to carry out their reforms into effect. Solon, who seems to have indulged in a more temporizing policy, confessed that he had not given to his countrymen the government best suited to their happiness, but most tolerable to their prejudices. And like Crugus, the more true to his object, was under the necessity of mixing a portion of violence with his authority of superstition, and at securing his final success by voluntary reunification, first of his country and then of his life. And these lessons teach us, on one hand, to admire the improvement made by America on the ancient mode of preparing the established regular plans of government. They serve not less, on the other hand, to admonish us the hazard and difficulties, incitement with such experience, and great imprudence of the unnecessary multiplying of them. Okay, so that was a really long paragraph. Like going, like, look at all the way that these ones failed. Let's show how we're going to do it and not do the failings. Okay. It is unreasonable conjecture that the errors which may be contained in the plan of convention are such to have resulted rather from the defect of experience on the complicated and difficult subject than to form a want of accuracy or care in the investigation of it. Consequently, such as will not be ascertained until an actual trier shall have pointed them out. This conjecture is rendered probable, not only by many considerations of general nature, but by the particular case of the Articles of Confederation. It is to be observable that among the numerous objections and amendments suggested by the several states, when these articles were submitted for their ratification, not one is found which alludes to the great and radical error which on an actual trial has discovered itself, and if we expect the observations which New Jersey was led to make, then rather her local situations, then by her peculiar foresight, it must be questioned whether a single suggestion was of sufficient moment to justify a revision of the system. There is an abundant reason, nevertheless, to suppose that the immaterial as the objections were, they would have been adhered to with a very dangerous and flexible in some states, had not had a zeal for the opinions and supposed interest been stifled by the more powerful sentiment of self-preservation. One state, we may remember, persisted for several years in refusing her concurrence, although the enemy remained the whole period at our gates, or rather at the very bowels of our country. Nor was her plancy, the quality of being easily bent, shaped, or influenced, in the end affected by less motive, that the fear of being chargeable with the protracting the public calamities and endangering the event of contest, every candid reader will make the proper reflections in these important facts. A patient who finds his disorder daily growing worse, and that efficacious remedy can no longer be delayed without extreme danger, after coolly revolving his situation and the characters of different physicians, selects and calls in such of them as he judges the most capable of administering relief and the best entitled to his confidence. The physicians attend, and the case of the patient is carefully examined. A consultation is held. They are unanimously agreed on the symptoms are critical, but that the case, with proper and timely relief, is so far from being desperate that it must be made an issue and an improvement of his constitution, that they are equally unanimous in prescribing the remedy by which this happy effect is to be produced. The prescription is no sooner made, however, than the number of persons interpose, and without denying the reality of the danger of the disorder, assume that the patient's prescription will be poison to his constitution, and forbid him, under pain of certain death, to make use of it. Make not that the patient reasonably demanded, before the venture to follow this advice, that the authors of it should at least agree among themselves on some other remedy to be substituted, and if he found them differing as much from another as from his first counselors, would he not act prudently, trying to experiment unanimously recommended by the latter, rather than hearkening to those who could neither deny the necessity of a speedy remedy nor agree upon proposing one? All right, so that's a really clever and a really wordy way. He's like, all right, just imagine we know the Artists' Confederation are a sick patient. We all came together as doctors. We all agreed, this guy's sick. We need to give him medicine. We all took around, thought, and said, hey, here's our medicine. All of us agreed unanimously. And now we have people that weren't involved, that didn't contribute to the diagnosis or the treatment, are coming in saying, don't take the medicine, it will kill you. And the patient being America. All right, such a patient is in such a situation is America at this moment. She has been sensible of her malady. She has obtained a regular and unanimous advice from men of her own deliberate choice, and she is warned by others against following this advice under pain of the most fatal consequences. Do the monitors deny the reality of the danger? No. Do they deny the necessity of some speedy and powerful remedy? No. Are they agreed that any two of them agreed in their objections to the remedy proposed or in the proper one to be substituted? Let them speak for themselves. He's like, all right, anybody else got a better idea? No? All right, then shut up. This one tells us that the prose constitution ought to be rejected. Germany, the back of the frame is behind the constitution unless Nicolas Cage stole again. Oh, generally, not... Yeah. Because it is not a confederation of states, but a government over individuals. Another admits that it ought to be the government over individuals to a certain extent, but by no means to the extent proposed. A third does not object to the government over individuals or to the extent proposed, but to want of a Bill of Rights. A fourth concurs that the absolute necessity of a Bill of Rights, but contends that it ought to be declaratory, not the personal rights of individuals, but the rights reserved to the states in their political capacity. A fifth option is that the Bill of Rights of any sort would be superfluous and misplaced, and that the plan would be unexceptional but for the fatal power of regulating the times and places of election. An objector in a large state exclaims loudly against the unreasonable equality of representation in the Senate. An objector in a small state equally loud against the dangers of inequality in the House of Representatives. From this quarter, we are alarmed by the amazing expense from which the number of persons who are to administer the new government. From another quarter, and sometimes from the same quarter, on another occasion, will cry that the Congress will be but a shadow of a representation, and that the government would be far less objectionable if the number and the expense were doubled. A patriot in a state does not import or export, discern insuperable objections against the power of direct taxation. The patriot advisory in the state of great exports and imports is not less dissatisfied than that of the whole burden of taxes may be thrown on consumption. The politician discovers in the Constitution a direct and irresistible tendency to monarchy that it is equally sure it will end in autocracy. Another is puzzled to say that these shapes, and it will ultimately assume that it must be one of them, while a force is not wanting who is not less confident affirms that the Constitution is so far from having a bias towards either of these dangers that the weight on that side will not be sufficient to keep it upright and firm against the opposite propositions. With another class of adversaries to the Constitution, the language is that of the legislative, executive, judiciary departments are intermixed in such a manner as to contradict all the ideas of regular government and the requisite precautions in favor of liberty. While this objection circulates in vague and general expressions, there are but a few who lend to the sanctions to it. Let each one come forward with his particular explanation, and scarce any two are exactly agreed upon the subject. In the eyes of the one junction of the Senate with the President in this responsibility function of appointing to offices instead of vesting this in the executive power, in the executive alone, is the vicious part of the organization. To another, the exclusion of the House of Representatives, whose numbers alone could be a due security against the corruption and partiality in the exercise of such power, is equally obnoxious. With another, the administration of the president into any share of power, which must be a dangerous engine in the hands of the executive magistrate, is an unpardonable violation of the maxims of the Republican jealousy. No part of the arrangement, according to some, is more inadmissible than the trial of impeachments by the Senate, which is alternately a member of both the legislative and executive departments, when this power is so evidently belong to the judiciary department. We concur fully, replied others, in this objection to the part of the plan, but we can never agree on the reference of impeachments to the judiciary authority would be an amendment of the error. Our principal dislike of the organization arises from the extensive powers already lodged in the department. Even among the zealous patrons of the Council of State, as the most irreconcilable variance is discovered concerning the mode which ought to be constituted. The demand of one gentleman is that the council should consist of a small number appointed by the most numerous branch of the legislature, another would prefer a large number considers it a fundamental condition that the appointment should be made by the president himself. As it can give no umbrage to the writers against the plan of the federal constitution, let us suppose that they are at the most zealous, so they are also the most sagacious. I think that's the third time I've read that word and had to look it up. For some reason, it's not sticking in my brain. Of these who think the late convention were unequal to the task assigned to them, and that a wiser and better plan ought to be substituted, let us further suppose that the country should concur both in this favorable opinion of their merits and in the unfavorable opinion of the convention, and should accordingly proceed from them a second convention with full powers and for the express purpose of revisiting and remolding the work of the first. Were the experiment to be seriously made, though it would require some effort to view it seriously in fiction, I leave it to be decided by the sample of opinions just exhibited, whether with all the enmity to their predecessors they would in one point depart so widely from their example as in the discord and firmament that it would make their own deliberations whether the Constitution, now before the public, would not stand a fair chance for immortality, as Lucretius gave it that to Sparta by making its change to depend on his own return from exile and death, if it were to be immediately adopted, and will to continue in force not until a better and until another should be agreed upon by this new assembly of lawgivers. It is a matter of both wonder and regret that those who raise so many objections against the Constitution should never call to the mind the defects that which it is to be exchanged for it. He's like, the reason we made the Constitution this way is because the articles were so crummy. He's like, do you forget that? Like, do you remember? You know why we did this or this way? You were complaining about the same thing we are. It is not necessarily that the former should be perfect. It is to be sufficient that the latter is more imperfect. No man would refuse to give us brass for silver or gold, because the latter had some alloy in it. No man would refuse to quit a shattered or toting habitation for a firm and a nice building, because the latter had not a porch on it, or because some rooms might be a little larger or smaller, or the ceilings a little higher or lower than his fancy would have planned them. But waiving illustrations of this sort, it is not the manifest that's the most capital objections urged against the new system lie tenfold weight against the existing confederation. It is an indefinite power to raise the money dangerous in the hands of the federal government. The present Congress can make requisitions to any amount they please, and the states are constitutionally bound to furnish them. They can emit bills of credit as long as they pay for the paper. They can borrow both abroad and at home as long as a shilling will be lent. Is an indefinite power to raise troops dangerous? The Confederation gives to Congress that power also, and they have already begun to make use of it. For some reason, I can't see like emojis like pop up in the chat. That's so weird. It is improper and unsafe to intermix the different powers of government in the same body of men. Congress, a single body of men, are the sole depository of all federal powers. It is particularly dangerous to give the keys of the Treasury and the command of the army into the same hands. The Confederation places them in both hands of Congress. Is the Bill of Rights essential to liberty? The Confederation has no Bill of Rights. Is it an objection against the new Constitution that empowers the Senate with the concurrence of the executive? Oh. For some reason, it just shows up as that little box with the X in it. I was like, I don't know. That was to make treaties, which what they are to the laws of the land, the existing Congress, without any control, can make treaties with themselves have declared, and most of the states have recognized to be the supreme law of the land. Is the importation of slaves permitted in the new Constitution for 20 years, but the old is permitted forever? Madison was really sure that, like, that was going to work. He's like, we'll put that on the Constitution. You can't import any more slaves after 20 years. It's over. And he was totally convinced that that was just going to work. He's like, slavery is going to be done in 20 years after we sign this Constitution. And he was really wrong about that. He was like, that was what I think that was Madison. That was his idea. It was like, hey, cut off importation. It'll be done. 20 years. We'll be good. I really wonder what changes it would make if he could see the future. I shall be told, however, dangerous this mixture of powers may be in theory, it is rendered harmless by the dependence of Congress on the state for the means of carrying them into practice. That, however large the mass of powers may be, it is in fact a lifeless mass. Then I say, in the first place, that the Confederation is chargeable with the still greater folly of declaring certain powers in the federal government to be absolutely necessary, and at the same time rendering them absolutely nugatory, like nugatory, no value. And in the next place, that the Union is to continue and have no better government to be substituted. Effective powers must either be granted to or assumed by the existing Congress. In either of which events, the contrast must be stated with hold good. But this is not all. Out of this lifeless mass has already grown an excrement power, which tends to realize the dangers that can be apprehended from a defective construction of the supreme government of the Union. It is now no longer a point of speculation and hope that the present distresses, or for some time to come, to yield any regular supplies for the public expenses. Yet must in hereafter be able to, under proper management, both to effect the gradual discharge of the domestic debt and to furnish, for a certain period, liberal tributes to the federal treasury. A very large proportion of this fund has already been surrendered by individual states, and it may with reason be expected that the remaining states will not persist in withholding similar proofs of their equity and generosity. We may calculate, therefore, that a rich and fertile country of an area equal to inhabited the extent of the United States will soon become a national stock. Congress has assumed the administration of this stock and has begun to render it productive. Congress has undertaken to do more. They have proceeded to form new states, to erect temporary governments, to appoint officers for them, and to prescribe the conditions on which such states shall be admitted into the Confederacy. All this has been done, and done without the least color of constitutional authority. Yet no blame has been whispered, no alarm has been sounded. A great and independent fund of revenue is passing into the hands of a single body of men, all caps, who can raise troops, all caps, to an indefinite number, all caps, and appropriate money to the support of a indefinite period of time. And yet there are men who have not only been silent spectators of this prospect, but who advocates for the system which exhibits it, and at the same time urge against the new system of objections, which we have heard. Would they not act with more consistency in urging the establishment of the latter, as no less necessary to guard the Union against future powers and resources of a body constructed like the existing Congress, than to save it from the dangers threatened by the present impotency of that assembly? I mean not by anything here said to throw censure on the measures which have been pursued by Congress. I am sensible that they could not have done otherwise. The public interest, the necessity of the case, imposed upon the task of overleaping their constitutional limits, but is not the fact of alarming proof of the danger resulting from government which does not possess the regular powers commensurate to its objects, the dissolution or usurpation of the dreadful dilemma to which it continually exposed. Publius. All right, it's number 38. What time is it? 2? What am I going? We can do another one. Number 39. The conformity of the plan to Republican principles. The last paper, having concluded the observations, were meant to introduce a candid survey of the plan of government reported by the convention. We now proceed to the execution of that part of our undertaking. The first question that offers itself, whether the general form and aspect of the government be strictly republican. It is evident that no other form would be reconcilable with the genius of the people of America. And I should say, every time I say Republican in this article, it is little r Republican, just in case anyone is confused. With the fundamental principles of the Revolution, or with the honorable determination which animates every votary of freedom, to rest on all our political experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-government. If the plan of convention, therefore, be found to depart from the republican character, little r, advocates the most abandoned to its is no longer defensible. What then are the distinct characteristics of the republican form? Were an answer to the question be sought, not by recurring to principles, but the application of term by political writers to the constitution of different states. No satisfactory one could ever be found. Holland, in which no particle of the supreme authority is derived from the people, has passed almost universally under the denomination of a republic. The other title has been bestowed upon Venice, where absolute power over the great body of the people is exercised in the most absolute manner by a small body of hereditary nobles. Poland, which is a mixture of aristocrats and monarchy in the worst forms, has been dignified with the same appellation. The government of England, which has one republican branch only, combined with the hereditary aristocrats and monarchy, has with equal propriety been frequently placed on the list of republics. These examples, which are nearly as dissimilar to each other as to the genuine republic, shown the extreme inaccuracy of the term which has been used in political distinguish. God dang. I'm just going to go on. If we resort to a criterion for different principles on which the different forms of government are established, we may define a republic to be, or at least may bestow that name on, a government which derives all its powers directly or indirectly from a great body of the people, and is administrations by persons holding to their offices during pleasure for a limited period, or during good behavior. It is essential to such a government that it be derived from a great body of the society, not from the inconsiderable proportion or the favored class of it. Otherwise, a handful of tyrannical nobles, exercising from the oppressions by the delegation of their powers, might aspire to the rank of republicans and claim their government to be the honorable title of republic. It is sufficient for such a government that the persons administrating it to be appointed either directly or indirectly by the people, and that they hold their appointments by either their tenures just specified. Otherwise, every government in the United States, as well as every other popular government that has been or can be well organized or well executed, would be degraded to the republican character, according to the constitution of every state in the Union. Some other of the officers of the government appointed indirectly only by the people. According to most of them, the chief magistrate itself is so appointed, and according to one, this mode of appointment is extended to one of the coordinate branches of the legislature. According to all the constitutions, also the tenure of the highest offices is extended to a definite period, and in many instances, both within the legislature and executive departments, to a period of years, according to the provisions of most of the constitutions, again, as well as according to the most respectable and received opinions on the subject. The members of the judiciary department are retained their offices by firm tenure of good behavior. On comparing the constitution planned by the convention with that of the standard here fixed, we perceive at once that it is the most rigid sense conformable to it. The House of Representatives, like that of one branch at least of all the state legislators, is elected immediately by the great body of the people. The Senate, like the present Congress and the Senate of Maryland, derives its appointment indirectly from the people. The president is indirectly derived from the choice of the people according to the examples of the most states. Even the judges, with all the officers of the Union, will, as in the several states, be the choice, though a remote choice, of the people themselves. The duration of the appointments is equally comfortable to that of the Republican standard, and to the model of state constitutions. The House of Representatives is periodically elected, as is all the states, and for the period of 2 years as the state of South Carolina. The Senate is elective for the period of 6 years, which is but 1 year more than the period of the Senate of Maryland, but 2 more than the Senate of New York and Virginia. It's going into a lot of unnecessary detail, but I guess he's just trying to show, like, hey, we took everyone's ideas and we're pushing them in here. Like, everyone is involved in this. The president is to continue in the office for a period of 4 years, as in New York and Delaware. The chief magistrate is elected for 3 years, as in South Carolina for 2 years. The other states, the election is annual. In several states, however, no constitutional provisions is made for the impeachment of the chief magistrate. And in Delaware and Virginia, it is not impeachable until he is out of office. The President of the United States is impeachable at any time during the continuance in office, the tenure by which the judges are to hold their places. It is at unquestionably ought to be that of good behavior. The tenure of the ministerial office general will be the subject of legal regulation comfortably to the reason of the case, to be the examples of the state constitutions. Could any further proof be required that the republic complexion of this system, the most decisive one, might be found in its absolute prohibition of titles of nobility, both under the federal and state governments, and is expressly guaranteed of the republican form of the latter? What's it talking about? Why is it yelling at me? Okay. I don't know why it's making me do that. But it is not sufficient, say the adversaries to the proposed constitution, for the convention to adhere to republican form. They ought, with equal care, to be preserved the federal form, which regards the union as confederacy of sovereign states, instead of which they have framed a national government which regards the union of consolidation of the states. And it is asked by what authority this bold and radical innovation was undertaken. The handle which has been made the objection requires it should be examined with some precision. Say the first 10 rights in the Constitution, old version. Without inquiring to the accuracy of the distinction on which the object is founded, it will be necessary to a just estimate of its force, first to ascertain the real character of government in question, secondly to inquire how far the conventions were authorized to propose such a government, and thirdly how far the duty they owed to their country would supply defect regular authority. First, in order of ascension, the real character of government, it may be considered in relation to the foundation to which it is established, to the sources from which its ordinary powers are to be drawn, to the operation of these powers, to the extent of them, and to the authority by which the future changes of governments are to be introduced. On examination of the first relation, it appears, on one hand, that the Constitution is to be founded on the assent and ratification of the people of America, given by deputies elected for special purpose, but on the other, that this assent is to be ratified, is to be given by the people, not individuals composing of one entire nation, but composed of the distinct and independent states to which they are respectively belong. It is to be the assent and ratification of the several states, derived from the supreme authority of each state, the authority of the people themselves. The act, therefore, of establishing the Constitution will not be national, but a federal act. That is, there will be a federal and not a national act, as these terms understood by the objectors the act of the people as to forming so many independent states, not as forming one aggregate nation, is obvious from the single consideration that it is to result neither from decision of majority of the people of the Union, nor from that of the majority of the states. It may result from a unanimous assentment of the several states that are party to it, differing no otherwise from the ordinary assent from that of being expressed, not by the legislative authority, but that of the people themselves. Were the people regarded in this transaction forming one nation, and the will of the majority of the whole people of the United States would bind the minority, in the same manner as the majority of each state must bind the minority, and will of the majority must determine either by the comparison of the individual votes or by considering the will of the majority of states, as evident as the will of the majority of the people of the United States. Neither of these rules has been adopted. Each state, in ratifying the Constitution, considering it as a sovereign body independent of all others and only to be bound by its own voluntary act. In this relation, the new Constitution will, if established, be a federal and not a national Constitution. The next relation is to the sources from which the ordinary powers of government are to be derived. The House of Representatives will derive its power from the people of America, and the people will be represented in the same proportion and on the same principle as in the legislature of a particular state. So far, the government is national, not federal. The Senate, on the other hand, will derive its powers from the states as political and co-equal societies, and these will be represented on the principle of equality in the Senate, are now in the existing Congress. So far, the government is federal, not national. The executive power will be derived from a very compound source. The immediate election of the president is to be made by the states in their political characters. The votes allotted to them are in a compound ratio which consists them partially as distinct and co-equal societies, partly as unequal members of the same society. The eventual election again is to be made by the branch of the legislature, which consists of the national representatives, but in this particular act they are to be thrown into the form of individual delegations from so many distant co-equal bodies politique. From this aspect of the government, it appears to be a mixed character, presenting as at least many federal as national features. The difference between the federal and national government as relates to the operation of the government is supposed to consist of this. The former of the powers operate on political bodies composing the Confederacy, in their political capacities, and the latter on the individual citizens composing the nation, in their individual capacities. On trying the Constitution by the criterion, it falls under the nation, not the federal character, though perhaps not so completely has been understood. In the several cases, and particularly the trial of controversies to which the states may be parties, they must be viewed and proceeded against their collective and political capacities only. So far, the national countenance of the government on this side seems to be disfigured by a few federal features, but this blemish is perhaps unavoidable in any other plan, by the operation of government on the people in their individual capacities. In an orderly and most essential proceeding may, on the whole, designate it in this relation a national government. But the government will be a national with regard to the operation of its powers. It changes its aspect again. We can contemplate it in the relation to the extent of its powers. The ideas of a national government involves in it not only the authority for individual citizens, but the indefinite supremacy of all persons and things, so far as they are objects of lawful government. Among a people consolidated into one nation, this supremacy is completely vested in the national legislature. Among communities united for a particular purpose, it is vested partially in the general and partially in the municipal legislators. In the former case, All local authorities are subordinate to the supreme and may be controlled directly or abolished by its pleasure. In the latter, the local or municipal authorities form distinct and independent portions of the supremacy, no more subject within their respective spheres to the general authority than the general authority is subject to them within its own sphere. In this relation, the proposed government cannot be deemed a national one, since its jurisdiction extends to certain enumerated objects only. So let's say that again. Its jurisdiction extends to a certain enumerated objects only, and leaves to the several states and residuary the inviolable sovereignty over all other objects. It is true that the controversies relating to the boundary between the two jurisdictions, the tribunal which is ultimately to decide, it is established under the general government, but this does not change the principles of the case. The decision is to be made impartially made according to the rules of the Constitution, and all the usual and most effectual precautions are to be secure in this impartiality. Some such tribunals is clearly essential to prevent an appeal of the sword and dissolution of the compact, and that it ought to be established under the general rather than under the local governments. Or to speak more properly, that it could be safely established under the first alone is a position not likely to be combated. We can try the Constitution by its last relation to the authority by which the amendments are to be made. We find it neither wholly national nor wholly federal. Were it wholly national, the supreme and ultimate authority would reside in the majority of the people, and this authority would be competent at all times, like that of the majority of the national society, to alter or abolish the establishment government. Were it to be wholly federal, on the other hand, the concurrence of each state in the Union would be essential to every alteration that would be binding on all. The mode provided in the plan of the convention is not founded on either of these principles, and requiring more than a majority and principles, and requiring more than a majority in particular computing the proportion of states, not citizens, it departs from the national and advances toward the federal character. In rendering the concurrence of less than the whole number of states sufficient, it loses the federal and partakes of the national character. The proposed constitution, therefore, in strictness, is neither a national nor federal constitution, but a composition of both. It is a foundation, it is federal, not national. In the sources from which the ordinary powers of government are drawn, it is a partially federal and partially national. In the operation of these powers, it is national, not federal. In the extent of them, again, it is federal, not national. And finally, the authoritative mode of introducing amendments is neither wholly federal nor national. Publius. All right, so I was doing a lot of work there to try to, he's coming and getting it from both sides. Oh, all right. This one, the last Madison one for a while. I guess I should do one more. I'm getting tired, but end on a nice number 40. All right. I guess I can do one more. The powers of convention to form a mixed government examined and sustained. Madison, January 1788. The second point to be examined is whether the convention were authorized to frame and propose this mixed constitution. The powers of convention ought, in strictness, be determined by an inspection of the commissions to give the members of their respective constituents. This was a big deal. No one really told them to go write a constitution. They all just kind of decided to do it. As all these, however, had reference either to the recommendation from the meeting at Annapolis in 1786 or that to Congress in 1787, it will be sufficient to recur these particular acts. The Act from Annapolis recommends the appointment of commissioners to take the consideration of the situation in the United States to devise such a furthering provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union, and to report such an act for the purpose of the United States of Congress assembled as agreed by them, and after the confirmed by the legislature of each state will effectively provide for the same. The recommendatory act of Congress is the words following: whereas it is the provision of the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union for making alterations therein by the assent of Congress of the United States, and of the legislators of the several states, whereas experience hath evidenced, and that there are defects in the present Confederation as means to remedy which the several states, and particularly the state of New York, by express induction to the delegates of Congress, has suggested in the convention to the purpose of the expressed form, and the resolution is that the convention appears to be the most probable means of establishing the firm national government. Okay. Resolved that, to the opinion of Congress, it is expedient that on the second Monday of May, the next convention of the delegates, who shall have been appointed by the several states, be held in Philadelphia for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation and reporting to Congress the several legislative and alterations provisions therein, and shall, when agreed to in Congress, conform to the states, render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union. From these two acts it appears, first, that the objects of the convention were to be established in the states a firm national government. The second was to be such that would be adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union. Third, these purposes are to be effected by the alterations and provisions of the Articles of Confederation, as to be expressed by the Act of Congress, or by such further provisions as it should appear necessary, and as it stands recommendatory Act from Annapolis. Fourth, the alterations and provisions were to be reported to Congress and the states, order to be agreed by the former and conferred by the latter. From the comparison of the fair... I just lost my spot. From the comparison of fair construction of the several modes of expression, it is to be deduced by the author under the convention acted. They were to frame a national government adequate to the exigencies of government and the Union, and to reduce the Articles of Confederation to such a form as to accomplish these purposes. There are two rules of construction, dictated in the plan of reason, as well as founded on legal axioms. The one is that every part of the expression ought, if possible, be allowed some meaning, and that made to conspire some common end. The other is that where several parts cannot be made to coincide, the less important should give the way to the more important part. The means should be sacrificed to the end, rather than the end to the means. Suppose, then, that the expressions defining the authority of the convention were irreconcilable at variance with each other, and the national and adequate government could not possibly, in the judgment of the convention, be affected by the alterations and provisions of the Articles of Confederation. Which part of the definition ought to have been embraced, and which rejected? Which was more important? Which was less important? Which the end by which means? Let the most scrupulous expositors of delegated powers, let the most invertebrate objectors against the exercise by the convention answer these questions. Let them declare whether the most importance to the happiness of the people of America that the Articles of Confederation should be disregarded and the adequate government be provided, and that the Union preserved, or the adequate government should be omitted and the Articles of Confederation preserved. Let them declare whether the preservation of these articles was from the end, from securing which reform of government was to be introduced as the means, or whether the establishment of a government adequate to the national happiness was the end by which these articles themselves originally aimed, and to which they ought, as insufficient means, to have been sacrificed. But it is necessary to suppose that the expressions are absolutely irreconcilable to each other, that no alterations or provisions to the Articles of Confederation could possibly mold them into a national and adequate government, into such a government that has been proposed by this convention, No stress, it is presumed, will, in this case, be laid on that title. A change of that could never be deemed an exercise in ungranted power. Alterations in the body of the instrument were expressly authorized. New provisions therein are also expressly authorized. Here, then, is a power to change the title, to insert new articles, to alter the old ones. Must it be necessary, be admitted to the power that is infringed? So long as the part of the old articles remain, those who maintain the affirmative ought to at least make a boundary between the authorized and usurped innovations, between the degree of change which lies within the compass of alterations and further provisions, and to what amounts to transmutation of the government. Will it be said, this is one paragraph. Come on, Madison, break it up. Will it be said that the alterations ought not to have been touched by the substance of Confederation? The states would never have appointed the convention with so much solemnity, nor described its objects with such latitude, if some substantial reform had not been in contemplation. Will it be said that the fundamental principles of the Confederation were not within the purview of the convention, and ought not to have been varied? I ask, what are these principles? Do they require that the establishment of the Constitution in the states should be regarded as distinct and independent sovereigns? They are so regarded by the Constitution proposed. Do they require that the members of government should be derived their appointments from the legislators, not from the people of the states? One branch of the new government is to be appointed by these legislators. Under the Confederation, these delegates of Congress may all be appointed immediately by the people. And in 2 states, they're actually so appointed. Do they require the powers of government should act on the states and not immediately on individuals? In some instances, as has been shown, the powers of the new government shall act on the states of their new collective character. In some instances also, those of existing governments act immediately on individuals. In the cases of capture, of piracy, of the post office, of coins, of weights, of measures, of trade, of trade with the Indians, of claims under grants of land of different states, and above all, the case of trials by court-martial in the Army and Navy, by which death may be inflicted, without the intervention of a jury, or even the civil magistrate. In all these cases, the powers of the Confederation operate immediately on the persons of interest in the individual citizens. Do these fundamental principles require particularly that no tax should be levied without the immediate agency of the states? The Confederation itself authorizes a direct tax, to a certain extent, on the post office. The power of coinage has been constructed by Congress as to levy a tribute immediately from the source also. But permitting these instances, was it not acknowledged the object of the convention and the universal expectation of the people that the regulation of trade should be submitted to the general government in such a form, would render it an immediate source of general revenue? Has not Congress repeatedly recommended this measure, not inconsistent with the fundamental principles of Confederation? Had not every state but one, had not New York herself so complied with the general plan of Congress as to recognize the principle of innovation? Do these principles, in fine, require that the powers of general government should be limited, and that beyond that limit, the states should be left in possession of their sovereignty and independence? We have seen that in the new government, as in the old, the general powers are limited, and the states in all unenumerated cases are left to the enjoyment of their sovereign and independent jurisdiction. The truth is that the great principles of the Constitution proposed by the Convention may be considered less as absolutely new than the expansion of the principles by which they have found the Articles of Confederation. The misfortune under the latter system has been that the principles are so feeble and so confined as to justify all the charges of inefficiency which has been urged against it, and to require a degree of enlargement which gives the new system the aspect of the entire transformation of the old. In one particular, it is admitted that the Convention has having departed the tenure of the Commission. Instead of reporting a plan required The confirmation of the legislators of all the states have reported a plan to which is confirmed by the people and may be carried into effect by 9 states only. It is worthy of a remark of this objection, though the most plausible, has been the least urged by the publications which have swarmed against the convention. The forbearance can only have proceeded from this irresistible conviction of the absurdity of subjecting the fate of the 12 states to the preservations or corruptions of a 13th. From the example of an inflexible opposition given by a majority of 1/16 of the people of America to measure the approved and called for by the voice of the 12 states, comprising 59/16 of the people, an example still fresh in the memory of indignation of every citizen who has felt for the wound and honor of prosperity of the country. As this objection, therefore, has been in a manner waived by those who have criticized the power of the convention, I dismiss it, without further observation. The third point to be inquired into this, how far the considerations of duty arising from the case itself would have supplied any defect of regular authority. In the preceding inquiries of power of the convention has been analyzed and tried with the same rigor, and by the same rules, as if it had a real and final powers for the establishment of the Constitution of the United States. We have seen in what manner they have borne the trial even that supposition. It is time now to recollect that powers which merely were advisory or recommendatory, that they were meant by the states, and so understood that by the convention that the latter would have accordingly planned to propose the Constitution to which it is to be more consequence than the power which it is written, unless it is to be stamped with the approbation of those whom it is addressed. The reflection places the subject in a point of view altogether different, and will enable us to judge with propriety of the course taken by the convention. Let us view the ground on which the convention stood. It may be collected from the proceedings that they were deeply and unanimously impressed with the crisis which had led the country almost with one voice to make so singularly and solemn an experiment for correcting the errors of the system by which the crisis had produced. They were no less deeply and unanimously convinced that such a reform as to be proposed was absolutely necessary to effect the purposes of their appointment. It could not be unknown to them that the hopes and expectations of the great body of citizens throughout this great empire were turned with the keenest anxiety to the event of their deliberations. They had every reason to believe the contrary sentiments agitated in the minds and bosoms of every external and internal foe to the liberty and prosperity of the United States. They had seen in the origin and progress of the experiment the alacrity at which the proposition made by a single state, Virginia, towards a particular amendment of the Confederation had been attended and promoted, and had seen the liberty assumed by very few deputies, by a very few states, convened at Annapolis, of recommending a great and credible object, wholly foreign to their commission, not only justified by the public opinion, but actually carried into effect by 12 out of the 13 states. They had seen, in a variety of instances, assumptions by Congress, not only recommendatory, but of operative powers warranted in the public estimation, by occasions and objects infinitely less urgent than those by which the conduct was to be governed. They must be reflected. That in the great changes of the established governments, forms ought to give way to substance, that a rigid adherence in such cases of the former would render normal and nugatory the transcendent and precious oh my god, I just clicked on that. Right of the people to abolish or alter their governments as they shall seem to the effects of the safety and happiness, since it is impossible for the people spontaneously and universally to move in concert towards their object, and therefore essential that such changes be instituted by some informal and unauthorized propositions, made by some patriotic and respectable citizen or number of citizens, They must have recollected that by this irregular and assumed privilege of proposing to the people's plan for their safety and happiness, that the states were first united against the dangers by with which they have threatened by the ancient government, that committees and congresses were formed and concentrated their efforts by defending their rights, and the conventions were elected in the several states for establishing the constitutions under which they have now governed. Nor could it have been forgotten that no little ill-timed scruples, no zeal for adhering to ordinary forms were anywhere seen, except in those who wished to indulge. This is like one giant long run-on sentence. Under these masks, their secret enmity to the substance contended for, they must have borne in mind that this plan to be framed and proposed was to be submitted to the people themselves. The disappropriation of the supreme authority would destroy it forever. Its appropriation blots to the ascendant errors of irregularities. It might have been occurred to them that this is where the disposition to cavil prevailed, that their neglect to execute the degree of power vested in them, and to still more the recommendation of any measure whatsoever, not warranted by the commission, would not less excite aversion than a recommendation at once to fully measure commensurate to the national exigencies. Had the convention, under these impressions, had the midst of all considerations, instead of exercising a manly confidence in their country, by whose confidence they have been so particularly distinguished, and of pointing out the system capable, in their judgment, of securing its happiness, taking the cold and sullen resolution of disappointing its ardent hopes, of sacrificing substantial to forms, and to committing the dearest interest of the country to their uncertainties of delay and the hazard of events. Let me ask the man who can raise his mind to one elevated conception, who can awaken in his bosom the one patriotic emotion, what judgment ought to have been pronounced by the impartial world, by the friends of mankind, by every virtuous citizen on the conduct of characters of this assembly? Or is to be a man whose propensity to condemn susceptible of no control? Let me ask what sentence he has in reserve for the 12 states who usurped the power of sending deputies to the convention, a body utterly unknown to their constituents, for Congress who recommended the appointment of this body, equally unknown to the Confederation and to the state of New York in particular, which first urged, then complied with this unauthorized imposition, but that the objectors may be disarmed of every pretext, it shall be granted that for a moment that the convention were neither authorized by commission nor justified by circumstances in proposing a constitution for the country. Does it follow that the constitution ought, for that reason alone, to be rejected, if according to the noble precept, it to be lawful to accept good advice even from an enemy? Shall we set the ignoble example of refusing such advice even when offered by our good friends? The prudent inquiry in all cases ought to surely be, not so from who the advice comes, but whether the advice is good. The sum of what has been advanced and proved is, that the charge against the convention of exceeding their powers, except in one instance, little urged by the objectors, has no foundation to support it. That if they exceeded their powers, they were not only warranted, but required, as the confidential servants of their country, by the circumstances in which they were placed, to exercise the liberty to which they assume, and that finally, if they had violated both their powers and their obligations in proposing a constitution, this ought nevertheless be embraced, if it be calculated to accomplish the views and happiness of the people of America. How far this character is due to the Constitution is subject under investigation. Publius. 40. All right. That's number 40. Only 45 to go. But that's all right. But that is enough for tonight. Got it through to an even nice number. I'll be definitely next Wednesday. I'm doing every Wednesday. A nice stream on Federalist papers. And then I don't know what I'll do after the Federalist papers. I try to do some Thursdays. I'll try to tomorrow. But every late night Wednesday, Federalist papers. If you are interested, hit me up next week. Streaming everywhere, I guess. But yeah, had fun. Hope some of y'all got some enjoyment out of that, or at least some information out of that. Hope everyone has a really good night. Have a good one.